You hear the name Abraham Lincoln, and what comes to mind? Probably a towering figure, right? The face on Mount Rushmore, the man who saved a nation. But behind that legend, there's an incredible story of a country and a leader pushed right to the absolute edge. So let's get into it. If you ask historians or look at pretty much any poll, Lincoln almost always comes out on top as America's greatest president. That's a heck of a legacy. But the story of how we got there, well, it wasn't a series of easy wins. It's a story of a deep crisis, a personal transformation, and a nation literally tearing itself apart. And that's really the big question we're tackling here. How did a prairie lawyer from Illinois, of all people, manage to guide a shattered country through its bloodiest war? And how did he, in the process, totally change the meaning of freedom in America? To really get Lincoln, you first have to understand the absolute firestorm he was about to step into. See, long before he ever got to the White House, the United States was a nation just teetering on the brink, completely torn apart over the issue of slavery. And this quote is everything. Years before he was president, back in 1858, Lincoln laid it all out with these famous words. This wasn't just some political line. He saw with chilling clarity that the country was on an impossible path. It couldn't just stay the way it was. It had to become all one thing or all the other. And things started to fall apart fast. In '54, the Kansas-Nebraska Act basically set the West on fire. Then, in '57, the Dred Scott decision from the Supreme Court said slavery could exist anywhere. And then came the election of 1860. Lincoln wins, but his name wasn't even on the ballot in 10 southern states. That was the last straw. Before he even took office, 7 states were already gone. The House was collapsing. So, who was the guy who had to somehow hold this collapsing House together? Well, his background was about as far from the powerful East Coast elite as you could possibly get. And that whole journey is what shaped him. His story is just remarkable. He goes from being born in a log cabin in total poverty with less than a year of actual school to teaching himself, becoming this sharp lawyer, and building a political career from the ground up in Illinois. It was those famous debates against Stephen Douglas in 1858 that really put him on the map. He lost that Senate race, but he became a national voice against slavery's expansion. Now, here's something you've got to understand about his position early on. Lincoln was not a radical abolitionist calling for an immediate end to slavery everywhere. No way. He knew that would be political suicide. His position, the Republican Party's position, was to stop the spread of slavery. The thinking was, if you could just contain it, you could put it on a path to ultimate extinction. It was a moderate stance, and frankly, it's the only way he could have gotten elected. This house in Springfield, it really symbolizes who he was before the presidency. A respected small-town lawyer, a sharp politician who knew the ins and outs of the game. All the skills he learned right here. How to persuade, when to compromise, how to be a ruthless politician. They were all about to be tested like never before. Because then came the election. In the moment he was inaugurated, the crisis just exploded. Lincoln the politician was gone. Overnight, he became a wartime commander-in-chief, staring down a challenge no president had ever even dreamed of. And this was it. April 12, 1861. The cannons opened fire on Fort Sumter. There was no going back. The war was on, and Lincoln's greatest test had just begun. So Lincoln's response was to make some huge and hugely controversial moves. He expanded the power of the presidency like never before. He blockaded southern ports. He even suspended habeas corpus. That's the right to even have a trial. He argued it was all necessary to save the country itself. And on top of all that, he just could not find a general who was willing to fight the war the way he wanted it fought. And this quote from 1862 is so important to understanding his mindset at the time. In the early days, his public message was crystal clear. My number one job, my only job, is to save the Union. Everything else, including slavery, was secondary to that one goal. But the war itself was about to change the goal. Yeah, the war itself became this incredible force for change. What started as a fight to just hold the country together, it evolved into a revolutionary struggle to finally end slavery and give America a new definition of freedom. When you think about the sheer cost of the war, the hundreds of thousands of lives lost, it just forced a moral change. The idea of just going back to the way things were with slavery still in place started to feel, impossible. The reason for all that sacrifice had to mean something more.
And that brings us to the Emancipation Proclamation. This was just a brilliant move, both politically and militarily. By framing it as a military order, it only freed enslaved people in the states that were actively rebelling. That meant he didn't tick off the crucial slaveholding border states that had stayed with the Union. So no, it didn't free everyone all at once, but what it did do was fundamentally change the war. From that moment on, the Union Army was officially an army of liberation.
And then came Gettysburg. At the dedication of the battlefield cemetery, Lincoln delivered what might be the most famous speech in American history. In just 272 words, he tied the sacrifice of those soldiers directly to the founding ideals of the nation. He said their deaths would ensure a new birth of freedom, so that government of the people, by the people, and for the people would not perish. And you can see his strategy unfolding in these clear steps. Step 1 was the proclamation. Step 2 was the enlistment of nearly 200,000 black soldiers, which was a total game changer for the war effort. And finally, step 3, Lincoln threw all his political power behind passing the 13th Amendment to make sure slavery was gone for good, everywhere, written right into the Constitution. So by 1865, the Union victory was in sight, but Lincoln's focus had already shifted to what might have been an even harder job, figuring out how to heal and reunite a country that had been completely shattered. And then, on April 9th, 1865, it was finally over. Lee surrendered to Grant. The 4-year bloodbath that had taken more than 600,000 American lives had come to an end. And this quote, from a speech he gave just a month before the war ended, it tells you everything about his plan for what came next. Think about it. With malice toward none. No revenge, no punishment, just a shared goal to bind up the nation's wounds. But he never got the chance to see that healing through. In one last tragic act of the war, just 5 days after the surrender, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. The man who had steered the ship through the storm was gone. His death instantly turned him into a national martyr. I mean, he did it. He had achieved his 2 massive goals. He saved the Union, and he ended slavery. But his vision for a merciful, generous Reconstruction, that died with him. He left behind a country that was back together, yes, but one that would struggle for the next 100 years with the deep, painful work of true reconciliation. And that really leaves us with one final big question. Lincoln's goal was to bind up the nation's wounds, a job that was tragically cut short. So it makes you think, what does that unfinished work of healing a divided nation mean for us, right here, right now?